And all that we've been doing the first like 7 weeks or so of school was just kind of a brief overview of Western philosophy from the ancient Greeks all the way up to the postmoderns. And I did this the first day of class, but just to remind you, what we're going to be doing is this is my little construct of the world, if you remember. And at the center we have animism, and then polytheism, radiating out. And then the three biggies we see today is theism, pantheism, and naturalism, materialism. And I'm not claiming this is reality, it's just a helpful tool or symbol where you can kind of zero in on where someone is coming from. And one of the first questions to ask from, you can ask, what was in the beginning? Just based on that answer, I could almost pinpoint where you are. And then with a few more follow-up questions like, what is the meaning of life? Like, why are we here? How did we get here? What happens to us when we die? Now, in addition to these five, and we're really going to focus on these three in this latter part of the class, but I want to get a running start so you at least know what these other ones are. We also talked how there's some hybrids in between these. Between theism and pantheism, we have panintheism. Between materialism and pantheism, we have scientific pantheism. If you remember that movie I showed you at the beginning of class, What the Bleep Do We Know? It was pretty much coming from this worldview piece, and they were attacking mostly this worldview piece, which I thought was super interesting. And then we have, in between theism and materialism, we have deism. And just a quick review of what these are and what I'm going to try to do with you the rest of this class. If you remember when we talked about Kant and others, how these worldviews or paradigms are like glasses. These glasses you're wearing that color everything you see. And like Kant said, people who think they're looking at the world without glasses on, he would call them naive realists. You're not acknowledging your own biases, your own presuppositions, your own points of view, your own enculturation, your own indoctrination, and each of those are going to add lens upon lens upon lens of the world we're trying to see. And so what I'm going to try to get you to do, I think we'll start with the familiar. I don't remember how I have it in the syllabus, but I think I'm going to start here. We'll start in familiar waters, and then we'll move through the circle. And we'll end up with naturalism, materialism, but contrasted with theism. So you all are probably mostly wearing theistic glasses right now. There might be a few exceptions among you, but you were probably brought up in this kind of culture. This is a theistic school. A lot of you probably believe you have a relationship or understanding of the God of theism. And so those are the glasses we'll start with. And we'll use those glasses to then critique pantheism and naturalism, materialism, from a theistic perspective. But then I'm going to ask you, as much as you're able, to take these glasses off and to put on these glasses. And then we're going to critique. First, I'm going to explain what the world looks like and how we got here, what the ultimate source of all light and life is. And we're going to critique theism from a pantheistic perspective. And we're going to critique naturalism, materialism from a naturalistic perspective. Then I'm going to ask you to take these glasses off and put on these, and this is where we find mostly atheists, agnostics, etc. And we're going to critique pantheism and then theism. And so I know I'm going to be asking you to do a lot of perspectival jumping around but welcome to my world. This is how I live. I've got 1,000 glasses that I can take on and off, and sometimes I get confused which ones I'm wearing, but I'm going to try to be fully into each of these worldviews when I'm teaching it. So once again, if you forgot my teaching style, when I'm teaching theism, I'm going to be full on baptized, dyed-in-the-wool theist. When I'm doing pantheism, I'm going to go into Buddha mind. And when I do naturalist, materialist, I'm going to have an atheist, naturalistic mindset. All right? So if you ever want to know what I actually believe, just have lunch with me or come to my office. But in here, you're probably just going to push me deeper into my position. So real quickly, in case you forgot, theist, this would be most of our Western religious tradition or Abrahamic faiths. So we would have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but it would also include sects or cults. So I would throw Mormons in here, Jehovah's Witnesses, Kabbalists, all these other sorts of people. Even Gnostics, to a degree, I might throw into this category. Pantheism, this is where we find most of our Eastern religious traditions. Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism would all fit into this category. Also kind of like the New Age movement we see here in California, and that sort of eclecticism. And then naturalism, materialism, this is where we find many people invested in the hard sciences. Remember, a naturalist believes that all phenomena has a natural explanation. You don't need anything supernatural to explain what's happening in the world. And a materialist simply believes only matter exists. And so I talked to you about, we have this dividing line where on this side, it's material, and on this side, it's spiritual. Pantheists are monistic materialists, and what I mean by that, I mean spiritualist, and what I mean by that is they only believe in one thing, but that one thing is spirit. So you can call it God, you can call it, whatever, but they're thinking in spiritual terms. The naturalistic materialists also believe things can be boiled down to the material, physical substance of the world. Now, whether that's one thing or multiple elements, I mean, that's up to debate, but they believe the underlying reality is physical material. And then we have theists, both Jews, Christians, and Muslims all believe in a real, concrete, physical material world, but they also believe in a spiritual reality. And so in that sense, they're dualistic in that they believe in a physical and material. Here, only material, here, only physical. And these folks are going to be kind of probably more in the spiritualist camp. I kind of see a lot of them kind of in between pantheism and theism, but I'm going to unfold that out next. Any questions about where we're going or what I'm going to try to do? So I'm going to present each one as strongly as I can, but they're also going to get critiqued by two other worldviews to see why they don't believe in them. All right? All right, well, let's just keep going then. First out of the chute, I want to start here at the center with animism. And once again, anyone want to remind me what an animist is?
Personification of something, an object or.
What about objects?
It's personified.
It's more than that.
They're all a lot of them.
Yes. They're personified because they're persons. Okay, so animism means everything is alive, or I want to qualify that with virtually everything is alive because there are some dead things. I should have brought one of my dead coffee mugs to show you the difference between a living mug and a dead mug. And this mug, number one, is quite alive, my longtime companion, and and whatever that may entail. I'll get more into that later. Oh, a little shout out for this book. This was the one I put in the syllabi. You're welcome to borrow my copy if you want. It's super interesting. If you have younger siblings or nieces and nephews in your life, this is great bedtime reading material. They'll have very vivid dreams. But it's written not as a novel, but more as a dictionary, like a reference. So it's hard to just kind of read through, but it's so interesting because you'll start to pick up themes in this book. And they have everything in here from the Genesis account to the Big Bang and everything in between. And I love how they're all thrown in there. Now, first thing the title might be off-putting to some of you, like, well, Genesis is the true account, it's not a myth. But can anyone tell me what a myth is?
A story passed down in generations.
Okay,
True.
yes. And there's something else about myths that make them myths.
There's no scientific.
So what's the opposite of science? The opposite of this one? Spirits. So supernatural. And this is purely physical or natural. These believe in the supernatural. And so a myth is a story with supernatural elements. Now, if you take this primary definition of myths, then Genesis absolutely falls under that because it's a story with supernatural elements. Now, the reason it's offensive to call something a myth in our culture is because it's been dominated by this worldview, which does not believe supernatural is real. Ipso facto, if you have a story with a supernatural element, it means it's not a real story. Are we following? See, and this is the power of those lenses. Just by your own definition of what's real or not will tell you how to even listen or take in different literature or stories. If you're already presupposed that there is nothing supernatural, then of course all these ancient texts, this book of creation myths is aptly napped of like fairy tales. So that's what we're talking about. I would get so annoyed at San Diego State because they would always be talking about the myth of the Genesis account, and I would call the professors on it, and see, it's like bait and switch, because they would just say, oh, it just means this, but they left out this part because they were naturalist materialists, my professors, and so what they were saying was, you're believing in fairy tales. Fascinating. All right. So back to animism. Animism is the belief that virtually everything is alive. And we qualify that because some things are dead. Things die when the spirit has departed. Death does not mean things cease to exist, it simply means they're disconnected. They can no longer interact. So when the spirit of my former coffee mugs died, it didn't mean that spirit ceased to exist, and even the physical remains of the mug are still with me. I use it as like a flower pot or something like that, but it's no longer a vessel for carrying beverages.
It has a mother?
A mother?
Mother? You said the...
No, another.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The mug before this one. His name was Guido.
Okay.
And it was a beautiful mug, but one day, I kid you, it was during finals week. He was sitting on my desk, and he like leaped off my desk and committed suicide.
Wow.
And he broke into like, I don't know, 50 pieces. I was so upset. It was back on the old campus. The stain was probably still there when the buildings got bulldozed into the earth, but I had to leave class, and one of my students said, it's okay, Blackburn, I'll take care of it for you. And when I came back the next day, there was Guido, who had been glued back together, and it was full of piping hot coffee. And I said, thank you, but I was horrified. It would be like if someone ran over your cat or something, and they said, don't worry about it, I'll fix it. And they sewed it all back together and then brought it to you in a box and said, here's your kitty. And I know the gesture was nice, but Guido was dead. And seeing him full of coffee, it was just heartbreaking because the spirit had departed. Many missionaries I've talked to affirm time and time again to me that this is actually the dominant worldview. And I find that super fascinating. And I get to go to Africa for the first time this summer, Lord willing, and this is what I expect to find. Even though the country I'm going to, if you look it up on Wikipedia or any of that, it will tell you it's like 98% Christian. But because of where it is, where the people came from, I'm assuming there's going to be massive amounts of animism with like a theistic veneer over the top of it.
What country?
What's that?
What country?
Oh, Zambia.
Nice.
Zambia. All right. So And I already talked to our Zambians that came and visited, and what we call this, and if you remember that term, it's called syncretism. And this is where you're bringing two divergent things into harmony together. And so I want to be really clear what we're talking about when we're talking about these different worldviews. And so with animism, this idea that virtually everything is alive. This podium, my shoes, this expo marker, the whiteboard, the chairs you're sitting in, the tables, they all have a spirit. Your spirits who are traveling around in physical form. This room is full of spirits. Okay. And so animists are really going to pay a lot of attention to this. But within this, it becomes manipulation or supplication of these spiritual powers for the most part. And people who have an aptitude or knack for this can rise into power and prestige in these cultures. And we're familiar with some in our culture, right? Like witches, sorcerers. Is that even close? Sorcerers, witches, close. Here on the border, we have brujos. Anyone know what a brujo is? Yeah, yeah, and this idea that this idea of like Santeria and other practices which are kind of like a hybrid of different African animistic traditions, perhaps some voodoo, which is also hybridized, which came to the islands. Someone told me in Haiti, something like 90% of the people are Catholic, but everyone practices voodoo. And I know that's hyperbole, but that's really interesting, and that's part of the syncretism I'm talking about, where you could actually talk about Jesus or the Lord's Prayer or Rosary, but you could actually be using them like spells or incantations for protection, to ward off evil, those sorts of things. And I'll ask people sometimes, I'll see them wearing a rosary or a cross, and I'll say, why are you wearing that? And if they tell me it's for protection, we're talking witchcraft now. This isn't just like, oh, I want to remember my Lord and Savior or what Jesus did for me. If you're wearing an object like that, especially if it gets like blessed by a priest or the Pope or something like that, it like ups the amperage, right, of supposedly the virtue coming out of this thing. What's the problem with those kind of power objects? I mean, even if it's true, even if they work, what's the problem? If you're putting your hope into a... Yeah, they break, they get lost. Then what happens? You're like without protection. I brought a few. These would fall under the category of either charms to ward off or scare away spirits in the forest. This is from Papua New Guinea, along with Molly Mongo there. Molly Mongo here is the first man. Kind of interesting. On the top, we see like this toucan and then a crocodile. So the first man came from a hybrid between the toucan and the crocodile. And so that's old Molly Mongo there. I'll put him down so he's not staring at you. Shh, be good. This is some juju. And juju is this idea where if you take like a claw or a fang or something of that nature from an animal, you're like taking part of that virtue or strength into yourself. So these are altalons. So the virtue in this would be, especially if you were traveling at night or wanted to have better night vision or that type of hearing or that sort of thing. So it's sort of this like sympathetic magic you're trying to develop. If you want like that strength or prowess, you might want to wear like a jaguar or panther claw or fang, you know. So lots of juju, lots of power objects. So you're probably familiar with at least this one, probably more than the other. Charms, I know they keep making a comeback in women's fashion wear, but this was a very ancient type of sympathetic magic. So say you were getting married, you would go to the local shaman, witch doctor, medicine man or woman, and you would ask them to bless an object that you would wear on your wrist or as a charm on your necklace, and it would be like a ward to protect your marriage. And then when you got your first home, maybe you would get a charm for your home, or you got a pet, or a child, or a vehicle, and you just keep getting more and more charms that have to do with your life. We even see this a lot of the syncretism still to this day in Mexico. I love to travel down into Mexico, and I think it was in, where was I? I think it was in Acapulco. And I went into this cathedral in Acapulco, and it was really interesting, especially if you're from more of a Protestant background and you're not used to the high church. But in this cathedral were all these glass caskets. Now, the bodies inside of them weren't human bodies, I don't think. I think they were like carved effigies out of wood. But when you would walk around the back of the church, people had stuffed their hospital wristbands into the glass coffins of various saints. And these were people they had prayed to, or the family had prayed to when they were sick. And when they got well, they would bring and put it in there as like a testimonial that this saint helped me in my time of distress. And it was quite fascinating because some were just full and others had maybe one or two in them. You could also buy things like little charms, and it could be like a foot, your human genitalia, lips, nose, eyes, ears, arms, hands, whatever was broken or not working for you, you would buy this little charm from like the curio shop, and you would tack it onto the cross. And we do something like a light version of that here, where people might write a little note of something they're struggling with or some prayer request, and they'll tack it onto a cross or something like that. So it's this really interesting type of sympathetic magic. And this goes all the way back to ancient times. So like my own people, the Celts, or peat bogs, and we still find these things today, and it's believed it was part of this sympathetic magic. Amulets, this would be like a power object to protect you against evil, and then a talisman, that's a really high-end one. And the most famous one I know of was owned by a Christian named Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And it was a crystal, and inside this crystal were placed two slivers, supposedly, of the true cross. And he would wear this into battle and other places, and he believed it protected him from harm and evil. But once again, this is magic, this is witchcraft, and in addition to these like physical objects, there would also be spells, incantations. This could simply be pharmaceutical, a deep understanding of the way plants and animals can interact with either the healing or poisoning of humans, or it could be purely spiritual, where you are doing psychic or spiritual attacks or even spiritual healings on others. And if you notice, a lot of these people, they have a dual role. They're healers and harmers, because it's often the same techniques, just inverted, that will bring the opposite effect. It's the same if you've studied any like Eastern martial arts, like Qigong or any of that. The same techniques they use for acupressure and acupuncture for healing, those are the same power points or pressure points they use to inflict maximum harm or damage. So you can use this knowledge for good or evil, for helping or for hurting. Any questions on this stuff? Do you see any of this in your circles or society? Please share if any of this is going on.
When I was younger, my family would practice Santeria.
Really?
My grandma would take me to this santero,
Mm-hmm.
and he had a black bird, like caged up, and I would sometimes see them take some birds and put a cup underneath and slit the throat and put the blood of the bird, and then get some grass and then start sprinkling the blood on people. It was really weird.
Would it kill the bird?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know that much about Santeria, but a lot of it is divination, and where they will actually like sacrifice a chicken and I believe read the entrails to look for signs or omens, portents. And that we have like in our metro, last place I saw was in San Francisco. I was just downtown San Francisco, and here's a Santeria shop where you could go in and do a full-on divination. It's fascinating.
I have a friend of mine he's Buddhist, and he has all these like healing crystals that like supposedly like, you know, he leaves out in the sun or whatever, and then he like uses them to like when he's feeling, you know, sad or he's feeling sick or whatever, and they supposedly like heal him. He uses their like puts them like around his body and stuff.
Right. Right, and the idea behind these crystals, once again, the way these people are going to study crystals and the way these people are going to interact with crystals are wildly different. Here they're going to be looking at their chemical composition, the way the carbon atoms are lined up. That's how they're going to evaluate crystals. And they'll have a scale of hardness and rarity and all that. These people may be looking for the spiritual properties or the vibrational, and I'm not even talking about physical vibrational. It could be a spiritual vibrational frequency coming off those minerals or gems. And it's part of why some New Age people believe wealthy people often get headaches or are depressed or unhappy because they're mixing these powerful crystals together, maybe rubies and emeralds, that are having a conflicting vibrational frequency. And so you need to pick and I don't know enough about crystals to tell you how to mix and match your fine jewels, but if you ever do get wealthy, you might want to look into that. So if you're noticing it's causing you duress. Spells, incantations. I don't know, sometimes I feel like even when I'm in evangelical circles, I'm not listening to people pray or communicate to God anymore. I feel like they're doing an incantation. And you might say, Blackburn, you're being silly or projecting, but am I? I mean, why do people talk funny when they talk to God? Why don't they just talk like we're talking now? Why do they go into this very formal, almost King Jamesian English? And it's like, do you not think God understands American vernacular or dialect? Or why do you keep calling God's name? Like, and I know I'm awful, but if someone starts doing that Our Father thing or Father God thing, I just lose it and I start counting. One guy in chapel had like 15 Father Gods in like a 2-minute prayer, and I was just like, wow, that was like a new record. It's like, I think God knows who you're talking to. You know, it would be like if you were talking to me and every third word you said, oh, and Fred, let me ask you about my grade, Fred. And Fred, I want to beseech you, Fred. And it's just like, stop calling my name. I'm listening to you the first time. What else? Any other spells or incantations that you notice in Christian circles? How about this one? One of the ways to get in touch with the spirit world is through song, dance, rhythmic motion. Fasting. Pilgrimage. These are all tried and true techniques of peeking behind the veil. And we certainly see these, maybe not dance so much in conservative circles, but you certainly see rhythmic like sometimes you'll see people rocking, right? If you look at the Jews before the Wailing Wall, they'll be praying in this rocking rhythmic motion. Even like little kids twirling, right, to create this like altered state of consciousness. That sort of idea, changing the way you're viewing things. Fasting will have profound effects upon your psyche and your spirit. Pilgrimages to holy spots, especially hallucinogenic drugs, mind-altering drugs, whether that's psilocybin mushrooms or peyote or Syncretism, these sorts of things are meant to like disrupt this illusion, this feedback we keep telling ourselves, and to get us to peek at the world without this comfort we have from our reason and our other senses. And so you'll see a lot of drug use in shamanistic properties or practices. Also, we also see a connection of this with sorcery in the scriptures. Often the word pharmacia or pharmacopoeia is translated as witch or wizard, sorcerer, and it's probably because they were using these things in their practices or their divinations, trying to look at the future. I don't know if any of you have been up for 36 plus hours, but things begin to change. You begin to see and hear things that other people are not necessarily seeing or hearing. And this becomes a question. Well, are you hallucinating, or are you tapping into something that you're normally not open to? And this becomes a question. And this would be my caution to you. Once you open the door to certain things, I don't know that you can close it again. I've talked to a lot of people who've dabbled into the occult, witchcraft, sorcery, that sort of thing, but mostly of a Satanistic type. And this isn't what I'm talking about here. This is all like pre even the character Satan as known in the Bible. This would be like Wicca, or those would be like the pre-Christian religions of ancient Europe, like the Druids, those people, or shamans, or witch doctors you see around the world. Now, from a Christian perspective, you might say, well, that is Satan, or that is demonic, but that is not how they're relating to it in their worldview. They're seeing these as spirits, which could be good, evil, or neutral. And that's also a difference you see in this worldview than you see in probably theism. I don't know that theists have like neutral spirits. You're either of the Father, or of Allah, or of God, or it's Satan, fallen angels, that sort of thing. Where in animistic cultures, there could be just powerful spirits, like water spirits, or wind spirits, that aren't good or evil, although they could bring blessing or harm, depending on their strength and timing and those sorts of things. Meditation, another way to still your mind without the side effects of drugs. And the advantage of meditation is you can make it stop when you want, where once you ingest certain drugs, you may be on that train for the next 24 plus hours, depending. So meditation is nice that if you need to go pick up the kids from school or take care of the dog, you can get off that hallucinogenic travel. Sleep deprivation, syncretism, all right? Now the animist, think how this is going to affect the way you live in the world. If I really believed everything in here was alive and had a spirit, I'm gonna treat it a lot differently than if I just think this is an inanimate piece of, just kidding, just for an illustration, buddy. But I'm gonna treat things very differently if I really believe they have being, if they have sentience. From this marker pen to the shoes on my feet, including other humans, plants, and animals. Because I'm realizing when I'm walking around campus, I'm not just picking leaves off of plants. To me, that would be like you just coming by and pulling a piece of my hair off or part of my beard. I'm just like, dude, come on. Now, does that mean animists don't eat anything or anything like that? Not necessarily. And this is where we have to look at the interplay, and especially among like the Native Americans. Just in North America, we're talking over 500 nations, so it's hard to talk in generalities, because we have the full gamut, from animist to polytheist to even perhaps certain types of in-between, panentheists, I would say. Anyways, in the Plains culture, they talk about the gift. And so part of living means other things have to die in order for us to live. That might be a plant you eat, it might be a deer or elk you kill and consume. The idea isn't that it's wrong to consume other things for us to live, but it's to be done respectfully. If you ever saw Last of the Mohicans with Daniel Day-Lewis, the opening scene is they have killed this beautiful elk in the forest, and the first thing they do upon catching up to their kill is they praise it for its strength, its beauty, and then they thank it for giving itself to their people so that we could live, so that we could wear your coat to stay warm, your flesh will become part of our flesh. And then the deal is someday those people that ate that elk will one day give themselves back to the earth, back to the cycle of life. And maybe that's just their body decomposing in the grasslands, and grass coming up out of their decomposed corpse, and then that's eaten by other deer and elk that are then eaten by people. And so you just have this constant loop and cycle where we all become a part of the other. And so just as I have to eat things to stay alive today, I do it respectfully. I only eat what I need, hopefully. I'm not being a glutton or a waster. and then one day I will happily give myself to be eaten by another. This is my favorite type of burial. It's not really a burial, it's called a sky burial. And they used to practice this in Tibet, where their shamans would burn juniper branches when someone had died, and the vultures have been like Pavlov's dogs, except with vultures. When they smell that juniper scent rising, they circle and they gather because they know someone's about to be returned. And the shaman will take a cleaver and hack the body up into like hand-sized chunks, and these vultures are huge. They're like the size of me, squatted like this, and they get in a circle around this body, and then the shaman throws them chunks. And then when the last chunk has been thrown and the birds fly away, they believe the spirit has been released. The Native American Plains Indians, again, would take the bodies and they put them up on scaffolds where it would rot, decay, maggots, worms, birds, whatever. It would clean off the bones, and then they would take the bones and put them in clefts of the rock in the mountains. So this idea of, it's not like in Western culture, right, where we want to like embalm people or put them in sealed caskets, and we have their body full of chemicals where they can't be eaten or they can't be returned into the cycle. And I notice even in our society, they're getting into these like compost burials, or like you're buried in like a pod that a tree grows out of. I mean, that's really kind of bringing it back to this idea of, let's stop acting like we're separate or apart from nature, but to be part of it. My people would always plant trees on the tombs of the dead. So graveyards, instead of tombstones, they would be like orchards, usually fruit trees. And this idea was that loved one is still giving, still participating in the community, and as you eat that fruit, it's almost like communing with dear old grandpa or grandma or whoever. And one day you too will become part of that orchard, part of that giveaway, part of that cycle of life. Disney's Lion King, kind of a hybrid between pantheism and animism, but they definitely played on that circle of life theme. Pocahontas, purely animistic. Super interesting. And so you can't use that one because that's my example if you want to do an application project. But look at my examples. So I asked for 10 examples in that project, and it's simple, right? You talk about the shaman at the beginning of the movie. You talk about old Grandma Willow. You talk about the otter and the rainstorm, or her sister and her brother. Everything is interrelated. It's connected. We're all a part of this hoop or wheel of life. Further to the north, with the Inuit people that live like within the Arctic Circle and subarctic realms, they have this idea of an Inuit. And an Inuit is like a collective soul or a collective spirit. So some animals have their own individual spirit, but some share an overarching spirit. So for example, everyone in this room as humans, you have your individual spirits. But something like maybe a fish might not have its own individual spirit, but has an overarching like trout Inuit that's looking out for the interests of all trout. So if you go to fish for trout, and when you catch a trout, you go, I got you, you stupid fish, and I'm gonna take you home and fry you and eat you and throw your head to the dogs and your tail to the cats. And you kind of make fun of that fish. Well, that fish trout Inuit in the future would tell trout, do not give yourself to that fisherman. He disrespects our people, he doesn't care about you, your kind, do not share with him. But for those who are respectful to the trout, who show proper benevolence, maybe feed them, maybe work in their care and preservation, well, yeah, give yourself to that person. They would do this with seals. The way you hunt seals in the Arctic would be to cut a hole in the ice because they have to come up for air, and they would wait for them. And when they came up for air, they would harpoon them, and then they would pull them out of the hole. But once again, like in Last of the Mohicans, they would praise the seal. They wouldn't mock it or make fun of it. And they would use every part of that animal out of respect. And they would face its head to the east so it could watch the rising sun, and then they would even breathe air into its dead lungs because that's what it had come up for. So it's this idea, not that you can't eat or use the natural world, but it's to be done in a respectful, harmonious way. And this would include even plants. I'll tell you one more Inuit story before I go to plants. When I worked on a trail crew in Yosemite, the mosquitoes were fierce. I'd never seen anything like it. We'd be sitting around the campfire at night and everyone would have their own cloud of mosquitoes above their head. I'll never forget one night, we're sitting around the campfire and this mosquito landed on the guy's next to me arm. And I don't know if you know this, but if you cinch your muscles, it will often pin their proboscis in your arm and they can't get away. You can just hold on to them. So he caught that mosquito and then he pulled him off and then he ripped off one wing and flicked it, and then he ripped off the other wing and flicked it, and then he put the mosquito on the log and he said, "Bite me now, bite me now." And I was like, "Have you no fear?" And he's like, "What's that mosquito gonna do to me?" I'm like, "Not of that mosquito, of the mosquito Inuit." And he's like, "What's the mosquito Inuit?" And I kid you not, just as he said that, every swarm from every person went to this guy and he went off screaming into the woods and we didn't find him for like 3 days. Yeah, it was bad. Mosquito Inuits. I have this whole theory about mosquitoes and it's all about vibrational frequencies. Because I tell them I cannot feed the whole forest, but I'm happy to share what I can. But when it's too much, I simply blow them off or brush them away. I don't swat them, I don't do that kind of violence because I want to keep this harmony, this relationship. Did you guys know only female mosquitoes suck your blood? Yeah. Fascinating. I think it's for their eggs, the protein to not fertilize their eggs, but to nurture, bring about their eggs to nutrition. So Collective Soul, if you ever heard that band, I don't know if that's what they're talking about. Questions, other questions, comments? Let's get to plants then. In the shaman Rolling Thunder, he actually traveled with Bob Dylan for a while. It was called the Rolling Thunder Review. And in his book, it was so interesting because he takes us even to the level of plants. And so he says, when you're out in nature, you don't just harvest plants. They don't belong to you, they belong to themselves. And just like I told you that example of me asking the sage plants if I could have some of them for, oh, that was an ethics class, for sacred purposes, whenever I'm in the woods and there's berries or something, I always ask the plant first, is it okay if I have some of your berries? I don't just assume, because I'm a human and they're a plant, I can just go and take whatever I want from whoever, however. And that has worked for me very well. What do you guys think about that? Is that appropriate or is that just nonsense?
So you eat the berries?
The ones that they share with me.
What else do you eat?
Greens, I'll eat whatever is provided.
Okay. I mean, I didn't know.
Trout, but always with the permission of
So
the
like
trout Inuit.
So you're out in the wilderness and there's certain things that you're looking for consumption, basically.
Sure,
Okay.
but the point I'm trying to get is, it's not just that I know what is edible for humans, I'm trying to be aware of this relationship and the being of the plant I'm taking from.
So if you went to a grocery store, would you be culpable if you ate the wrong salad because the people who harvested that lettuce didn't ask the plant?
Yeah, see, that's part of the problem of living in our mass-produced society, right? We've become so detached from our food. Sometimes it's unrecognizable that it was something even organic. In fact, who knows, we might even be moving away from organic food, having more lab-based food. But that's a problem, right? And look at the fruit in the supermarkets. Yeah, it's all pretty, it's all the same size, it's all about the same ripeness. That is not how fruit grows if you've ever had even a fruit tree, right? You get little ones, medium ones, big ones, but because for packaging and what consumers expect, we have these standards of how things should look, whether that's our eggs or our meat or our fruits and vegetables. But when's the last time you had a cheeseburger and you actually made the connection that something had to die for me to be enjoying this tasty burger? we're so detached from that. If you grew up on the farm in a country, though, and you had to raise and kill your own animals, you see how serious that is. It's part of why I'm not opposed to hunting, because almost every hunter I've ever met had a profound respect for the animals they were hunting. Trophy hunters, that's a different category for me.
I was just about to say that.
That I do not respect in any sense. I just think it's for glory, for ego, like I killed the biggest this, or I'm checking off all the animals I've killed. I just don't have time for that. But people that are actually eating, living off the land food, I mean, you generally see a very sympathetic relationship and understanding. You have to understand that animal to hunt it. That's part of being a hunter. You have to know what they eat, where they sleep, their patterns of behavior. Anyways, do you think, let me make it more personal for you. Can someone be a Christian and an animist? Or are these, from what I've told you, are these mutually exclusive worldviews? But could you combine these two? Let's start with this. Is there any animism in the Bible?
Yeah.
Ooh, tell me.
Talking donkey.
Yes, a talking donkey. What was that all about? Yeah, we got the talking snake back in Genesis, right? But you could just say, oh, Blackburn, that's a metaphor, right? Let's not get carried away. That was Satan, or was it? Seemed like it was a legged snake, which that's freaky. What was with the talking donkey?
There was a prophet that was going from one town to another, and
Is that Balaam?
yeah, Balaam.
He was going to go curse the children of Israel,
Yeah.
and God sent an angel to kill him. And the donkey juked out of the way twice, and on the third time, the prophet was so angry because he couldn't see the angel that the donkey could. He took out his sword and was going to kill it, and it said God loosened the ass's mouth, and he basically went off on the prophet. It's just like, what's your problem? And what I love about that passage, it doesn't say God put words in the donkey's mouth. It simply said he loosed his mouth. Like, this is stuff that animal had been thinking for maybe years, and now he got to express it once. Any other animism in the Bible? Yeah.
I don't know if it's applicable, but like when Jesus commanded the sea to be still, and then the disciples were like, how can the wind and the sea obey him? I think that's kind of an example.
Oh, right. And this is where it gets tricky. And to be fair, are we talking about what you mentioned, personification? Or are we doing anthropomorphism? Or zoomorphism? All right, so with these figures of speech, or part of our English grammar, personification is when we're simply giving human characteristics to non-human things, or like anthropomorphism, anthros for humans, and like old woman Willow. That was more of like an anthropomorphism, but the belief was an animistic belief, but they were putting it in like ways children could understand. Willow trees do not have old lady features normally, and they don't speak in English, but that does not mean they're not alive. They don't have will, they're not making choices, they're not giving gifts or putting in roots or putting out branches. And so that would be my distinction. And when you look at the Bible, you have to do the same thing. Is this like poetic language? Is it like a figure of speech? Like where it talks about we are trees planted in the garden of God? Are we literal trees, or is that a metaphor talking about how God's the gardener caring for us, sustaining us? Or when it talks about zoomorphism is where you give animal traits or characteristics to a non-animal things. And we have lots of zoomorphism, like the lion of the tribe of Judah, the Lamb of God. Does that mean Jesus is really a seven-horned, seven-eyed lamb? Probably not. I mean, I'm not going to be too freaked out if he is, but Probably not. It's probably a figure of speech to give imagery and symbolism. When it talks about God wanting to shelter us under his wings, I don't think God's like a big chicken or a big sage hen that's gathering us up like chicks. It's a figure of speech to communicate. But what about, I was going to use my phone, in the last chapter of Joshua, he knows he's going to die, and he wants to give his last little exhortation to the children of Israel. And if you think I'm making this up, you can look it up for yourself. I believe it's the last chapter of Joshua. And the tabernacle has been set up at, is it Shiloh? Shiloh, yes. So they've crossed the Jordan, they set up the tabernacle, and Joshua places a stone there, like I'm imagining this big boulder, and he says, "Let this stone be a witness between me and you, for it has heard everything that you said." Now, what is that? Is that a metaphor? Is that literal? Do stones really hear? Or is it just like, hey, if people doubt what's going on right now, we can point to that rock and say, that rock was here when Josh was here, that was here when you all said. So you have to decide for yourself whether that's animism or not. But that's super interesting to me.
And Jesus says, you know, the whole like, if creation, if you cease to praise me, then the very stones will cry out.
Right. Probably not in Hebrew or Aramaic, but there would be some way the creation itself could communicate its response to the Creator. Fascinating. So, very interesting. So back to my question. Could someone theoretically be an animist and a theist, or are those mutually exclusive? Remember, theists believe in a God that's immanent and transcendent, a God that's outside of and beyond all things, and a God that permeates all things. This God is also a person. It's not like a force. This isn't like Star Wars. This is an actual being. But it's not a human being, unless you want to talk about the incarnation. This is a spirit, an eternal being, which is really hard for us to wrap. Can you believe in an eternal being like that, a creator, but also believes the creation is animated? This is, by the way, where we get anime from, the Japanese anime. And I would highly recommend anything by Miyazaki, Studio Ghibli. It's just full of this stuff. I have a few if you want to borrow them, but I think Netflix is going to have them out soon. I think they got an exclusive right to Studio Ghibli. But there's great ones like Spirited Away, which is like a bathhouse for the spirits, and they go in to get all cleaned up. Princess Mononoke, she's fighting the evil industrialists and miners and smelters with the forest animals and the forest spirits. So it's one of those great nature versus industry sort of conflicts. Still waiting on my answer. It's not like it's recorded or anything. No one's going to know who you are or what you said. Do you think it's inappropriate for me to ask permission from, like, I have a lot of citrus trees on my property, which isn't really my property. I'm just a caretaker. I can't own property. What silliness. Once again, huge conflict of worldview. That Pocahontas movie by Disney, that's another great theme, showing the mentality of the white English settlers who just saw the forest as board feet of lumbers. They saw valleys as places where you could put a dam. They saw animals as fur, right? Even frogs were just little green frog skins, right? It's just like money, money, money. It's let's dig, let's rape, let's pillage, where you saw it contrasted with the Native Americans trying to live in this harmony, balance, all that. Now, yes, there was a lot of hyperbole. There were tons of atrocities by the Native Americans towards themselves, each others, and the people from Europe weren't all evil, but it does show that contrast and the misunderstanding, like, can we buy this island off you with beads, right? It's like, sure, because obviously you can't sell a land, so we'll take whatever you want to give us. It's just a complete misunderstanding. And the idea of stewardship versus dominion, really different concepts. In Native American ethical decisions, they would often ask, how will this affect 7 generations into the future? Not just about us, not just about our needs, our desires, but how is this going to affect those that come after us? We could probably use a little of that. Hey, look.
I was gonna say, I think it's possible to have a little bit of both, when you're doing, like, if you're, if you're like being thankful for this stuff, you're able to get, I feel like it's okay to do that as long as you understand where it's coming from, and realize, like, these are gifts from God, and then ultimately that glory is going back there. I feel like it's possible for both to coincide together.
So as long as I don't confuse my navel orange tree with God, and realize God made the tree made the oranges, I'm going to eat some of the oranges, so it's okay to thank the tree and God for making the tree? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
All right. Any other thoughts? Does that sound weird to you guys?
That sounds reasonable.
That sounds reasonable?
Yeah.
Really? Man, you guys are so different than in years past. That really sounds reasonable?
But you're still worshiping that tree in some awesome way when you really should be worshiping.
No, you're just thanking the tree for the orange. That's a big difference from worshiping. Right? Like say maybe you were having some hard times and you needed like $5 in gas to get home. And you're sitting in class praying like, oh, Jesus, I hate to ask, but I need some gas money. And so you come up to me after class and say, Blackburn, do you have a $5 you can spare? And I'm like, sure, I'd be happy to. And you just said, thank you, Jesus, for providing. And you walked out the door and you just acted like I wasn't even part of that process. That would be inappropriate. Now, you thanking me for some gas money isn't worshiping me. It's simply acknowledging my part I played in God providing for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but the tree doesn't have a will.
It doesn't?
Not in and of
You don't think trees have wills?
Not in and of themselves.
Oh man, you need to hang out with more trees. Then why don't they all grow the same?
Because of the light is differently.
Oh, because of their environment?
Yeah.
Oh, you're being such a materialist right now. Oh no, Blackburn, it all has to do with nurture and nature. There's no choice. It's all determinism. It has to do with their environment, how much sun they got, how much light. But do you know anything about pruning trees? Do you know what's happening when you prune a tree? You're actually psyching the tree out. It thinks it's about to die. And so when a tree thinks it's about to die, it massive produces blooms and then fruit, because it's like its last swan song to pass itself on into the future. And so when you go in and prune a tree, you're really like psyching out its mind. And did you know even the Bible gives trees a Sabbath where you're not allowed to mess with them? Once every 7 years, trees are just to be left alone. They're not to be pruned. And any fruit they do produce is for the wild animals or strangers, widows, orphans, those people in the land. It's like a social net, social safety net. Awesome. Even fields, even the land itself gets a Sabbath once every 7 years where you have to let the land be. Even animals get a Sabbath 1 day a week where they don't have to work. Your oxen, they get a day of rest just like people. How awesome is that? That was part of the injunctions. When the Jews came into the land, they weren't to chop down the trees. They weren't to salt the field. They were to let it be. That was part of, I love it, protection and provision even for animals, plants and animals. I had one student tell me, says, hey, it's my orange tree. I can pick the oranges off it whenever and however I want. And I was like, yeah, but do you understand the kind of relationship you have with your tree now? You're like making that tree your property, like you own it. I have a lot of animals that live with me, but I don't have any pets because I don't believe in pets because they're sentient individual beings and they simply happen to be living with me. Now there are rules living with me for harmony of everybody, but I'm not pretending like I own them. Just like I don't own my children, I'm simply caretaking them until they fly away, hopefully. But how can I miss them if they won't go away? I guess that's a good sign if they don't want to fly away. All right. Well, I thought this would be more engaging for you guys. No? All right, well, let me just wrap up the animism then. So it is okay to eat flesh, eat fruits and berries, eat roots, that sort of thing. The mentality, though, needs to be, I understand we are all created by one creator, and we will all go back to him, at least our spirits. Our flesh will go back, but our spirit will go back to God. By the way, that's right in Ecclesiastes 3, if you think I'm making that up. Towards the end of the chapter, Solomon is asking the question, who knows if the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of beast goes downward? He's speculating on what happens to people when they die. He's not speculating about whether or not animals have spirits. That's just a given for him. And you could say, yeah, but that Hebrew word could just mean breath, but it's also the word used for the very life within us. And in the Psalms, it tells us God sends forth his spirit and there is life, and he gathers his spirit back into himself. It's a really interesting way to think about the very life force or principle within the world. And so animism is really focused on that. The downsides, of course, of this theory is there's so much fear, anxiety, superstition, etc. Because there are no coincidences. If you're sick, it's because some spirit or other person is attacking you, and you need to find out why. That first part of the Pocahontas movie they didn't elaborate on, they had just done a raid on another village. Do you understand how much more dangerous a dead enemy is than a live enemy? Because a live enemy you can hear or see coming. A dead enemy could attack you in your dreams, in your food, through your own weapons, your own family, other animals. And so a spiritual enemy, disembodied, is much more dangerous. So you would have to have the shaman pacify the spirits of the dead. And that's part of why I brought this in. This is very common among tribal or animistic societies. I got this one in Mexico for Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead. But we have this in Japan with the Odan Festival, where you dance with your dead relatives. Thanks for catching Molly. We're also in Africa, very interesting, running out of time. This idea of, you're doing great, by the way, with that camera. We're almost done, 5 minutes. In Africa, we have this idea, and if any of you saw the movie Coco, it's very similar concept, even though that was Mexican. So here we have the living. When you die, you go into this category called the living dead. And as long as someone is still here that knew you, you stay in this category. But when the last person that knew you dies, so for my grandma, it will be like my nephew. When he dies, there won't be anyone else that remembered her, and then she will pass into the spirit realm, little s spirit. And then you have God, or the Creator. This would also be like Mulan, if you saw that movie, this idea of your dead ancestors. Once again, death does not mean extinction, it means disconnected from their bodies. But they're not necessarily disconnected from your life. So the living dead can still look after you or mess with you. Like, just because grandma's gone doesn't mean her rules and values are no longer a part of your life, because she's watching and she can help you or make life difficult. She can also be an intermediary between the spirits and the living. And once again, the syncretism, this is part of where you get saints' days, intercession of saints to pray for you, because they're in this realm. Once you go into the spirit realm, now you can become an intermediary between God and the living dead. Certain shamans or medicine mans or wizards, sorcerers, have the ability while they're still living to perhaps make these different connections. And that's why they would be sought out to talk to the dead, right? Maybe you want to check in on your lost loved ones or stuff. These necromancers, these people who deal with the dead. 2 minutes? What's the Bible have to say about dealing with the dead? Remember Samuel and the Witch of Endor? What was that all about? He wanted to find out about how the battle was going to go. And he wanted to talk to Samuel, of all people, to raise a prophet of God from the dead. And what did Samuel tell him? That was Old Testament, sorry. He said, tomorrow you're going to die, and your sons. And why are you disturbing me? It was like a capital offense to use a witch in Israel. And witches, Leviticus 19, they're to be put to death. So why are evangelicals okay with sorcerers and witches and wizards in pop culture? Or are they? Were you guys allowed to watch Harry Potter and stuff growing up? Was it? You weren't. Did they give you a reason why?
My parents said it was like witchcraft.
It is witchcraft. It's not like witchcraft, it is. Anyone else not allowed to watch it?
I was not allowed to watch Harry Potter, but I was allowed Lord of the Rings.
Did they explain the subtle theological differences to you?
Slightly.
Please.
With the Lord of the Rings, you get the Christ parallels.
Good.
Uh,
Good versus evil.
Yeah, good, evil.
Got it.
Ultimate sacrifice. One for the entire world.
Got it. Still wizards, though.
True.
I don't.
So it was a walk carefully.
Sure. All right. Fair enough. And I'm not telling you what you should or shouldn't watch, but if you talking about you take the Bible seriously and all that, I think that's something you might want to look into. Like, why is there such these massive prohibitions against this sort of manipulation of the natural world, as opposed? And what I think happens is that veneration or supplication or trying to keep the spirits at bay can easily turn into a type of worship. And once you begin to worship the creation rather than the creator, that's where you've crossed the line, in my opinion. That's a big difference than thanking, and I'm going to close with this, thanking the chicken McNuggets you eat and say, may you cluck in the barnyard of my heart. Or when you eat that filet of fish sandwich, you say, may you swim in the ocean of my soul. That's very different than me worshiping chickens or worshiping fish. Okay, all right. Next time we'll pick up on Pauline.